Fellas, if someone was to ask you what is the 1 to 10 scale in the UFC, if you had to think of fighters throughout the 1 to 10 category on a scale with 10 being the best and 1 being the worst, you could probably think of a few fighters, but I'm going to think of a fighter to represent every single number on the 1 to 10 scale in terms of skill. So from 1 out of 10 being one of the worst fighters in UFC history to ever touch the UFC octagon, and then 10 being this is one of the best fighters to ever grace the UFC and is probably the most skilled fighter we have in the UFC. So I thought of a few fighters throughout the history of the UFC that could fit each number in this 1 to 10 scale of skill. Let me know if you agree with this scale, if I should have replaced any other fighters, but we'll start off at the all-time low, a 1 out of 10, a 1 out of 10 fighter, and that goes to CM Punk. The guy who joined the UFC and he was remembered for being absolutely destroyed. One of the most embarrassing signings in UFC history. It has to go to CM Punk. People love to use CM Punk as an example of what not to be in the UFC. Joining the UFC honestly kind of ruined CM Punk's career because he was remembered as like a badass guy in WWE. So for him to join the UFC and get absolutely demolished, and in his debut he got absolutely battered, but fair play, it was against Mickey Gall. And then in his second fight it was against Mike Jackson, who was practically a kickboxer, and not even a kickboxer, a cameraman who worked for the UFC who had some kickboxing experience. So they just hired Mike Jackson so that CM Punk could get a free win, and he couldn't even beat him either. He got beaten up pretty badly by him too. So CM Punk, his entire UFC career has kind of just been him getting destroyed. He should have never joined the UFC. It's obvious the UFC just saw the success of Brock Lesnar and they thought they could recreate that by adding CM Punk, but that definitely didn't happen. So as 1 out of 10, the worst fighter in my opinion, maybe not the worst, but at least one of the worst notable fighters to ever grace the UFC. And he has to go to the man himself, CM Punk. I honestly can't think of anyone in the UFC that I could have given CM Punk to have as like an easy fight. I think Mike Jackson was quite possibly the easiest fight that CM Punk could have had, and he still didn't manage to beat him. So CM Punk, he's going to have to represent the 1 out of 10 fighter. I don't know what the UFC were thinking by adding CM Punk. If you're going to add someone from WWE to the UFC, at least add someone who's got at least 1 or 2 fights of MMA experience, not just somebody who's good on the mic in WWE. So CM Punk, he's going to have to go last place for me. And at number 2 is a guy we have just mentioned, and it is Mike Jackson himself. I don't know too much about Mike Jackson. I don't think he has a combat sports background. I'm pretty sure he's just a cameraman in the UFC who had kickboxing experience, so the UFC brought him over. Yeah, this dude's UFC career has been pretty bad. Also, well, he also got finished in the first round by Mickey Gall, got submitted in the first round, similar to CM Punk. Then the dude went to a decision with CM Punk. I mean, we're talking about CM Punk being a 1 out of 10 fighter. So if you can't even finish a 1 out of 10 fighter, that just says something about the fighter you are. Then in 2022, he had a win over a guy called Dean Barry, but it wasn't really a win. It was a disqualification in the first round because Dean Barry was being fouled, and that dude's not even in the UFC anymore. So that's not an impressive win. And then he fought Pete Rodriguez and got absolutely brutally KO'd. And I'm pretty sure it's safe to say we're never going to see Mike Jackson in the UFC again. He got brought in the UFC as like an easy win for CM Punk. Ended up not actually beating CM Punk easily. And then for the rest of his UFC career, has kind of just been a punching bag, a guy who they kind of bring in every now and then to test prospects on. So Mike Jackson, he's going to have to go out of 2 out of 10. Yeah, definitely one of the least skilled fighters in UFC. I mean, the dude got destroyed by an old Jake Shields not too long ago. So Mike Jackson's at number 2. In the number 3 spot, we have Askar Movsarov. Now, if you don't know who this guy is, he's essentially an MMA fighter who frauded his way to the UFC. Lied about his record, lied about everything, and he completely just lied about his record. His actual record is 19-13, but he came in acting like he's undefeated. He came in acting like an absolute prospect. Fought Alonzo Menifield in his debut, which, you know what, that's a respectable guy. Alonzo Menifield's a ranked light heavyweight, but got finished in the first round and he got sent out the UFC immediately for having a fraudulent record. And anyone who joins the UFC after getting exposed for being a fraud, a bad fraud as well, they've got to make the list. So for Askar Movsarov, don't know how the dude ever made it to the UFC. If he never frauded his record, he would have never even touched the UFC or gone close to touching it. So this dude's going to have to get a 3 out of 10. Super unskilled. And yeah, fair play. Should have never even been in the UFC. And then a 4 out of 10 fighter. Now we've gotten into fighters who have had a somewhat competitive career in the UFC, but are still on the, the lower end of skill when it comes to the UFC. And we have Smiling Sam Alvey. This dude went on one of the biggest losing streaks that I've ever seen. I think he was on like a 9-fight losing streak with like a draw in between. I don't know what the UFC would think about keeping this guy in the UFC for so long. I'm pretty sure he's having success in other MMA organizations like little local shows. But no, this guy has been kind of beaten by every middleweight and every light heavyweight you can think of. Jimmy Crute is beating this guy. Ryan Spann, Brendan Allen, Mikal. Everyone has practically had a turn on beating up on Sal Alve. He had some decent wins. Gian Vellante, to name, Marcin Petrino, Rashad Evans. He's got some wins over his name, so he's not like a complete bum like a CM Punk or a Mark Jackson. But he will always be known for being on one of the biggest losing streaks in the UFC. Again, I'm surprised he didn't get caught after 4 losses. Never mind, what was it, like 9 losses in the UFC in a row? So, Sam Alve, definitely known for being on a losing streak. Definitely didn't have one of the best careers in the UFC. But you know what? Fair play to the guy. I reckon he could still beat a few guys on the current UFC roster. I honestly do. I think if you were to match Sam Alve against every single not ranked, but every single middleweight and light heavyweight on the roster, there'd be 1 or 2 that he's able to get a win over. So Sam Alve, I'll give him a 4 out of 10. And now we're on a 5 out of 10. Fighters who kind of fell off. And we've got Tony Ferguson. Yeah, it's kind of sad to put Tony Ferguson as a 5 out of 10, considering this guy was once the interim champion, and people were saying that this guy could potentially beat Khabib Nurmagomedov. But for Tony Ferguson, I think he's a 5 out of 10 fighter in the UFC. He's extremely average nowadays. Most of the top guys will completely destroy Tony Ferguson. Anyone who's close to being ranked will beat Tony Ferguson, but I still think there's a few random unranked guys who Tony Ferguson could beat up on and get a few wins. But yeah, man, to go from getting matched up against Khabib Nurmagomedov to now being a 5 out of 10 fighter hurts. We talked about Sam Alve being on a big losing streak, and now Tony Ferguson has turned into that guy. He's on a big losing streak, a 7-fight losing streak. At first, it was against respectable names. Justin Gaethje, Charles Oliveira, Dariush, Chandler, those type of guys. But that performance he had against Nate Diaz was honestly sad. Him getting demolished by Paddy Pimblett for 3 rounds, that was the fight where we kind of saw that, Tony Ferguson, he needs to get out of the UFC as soon as possible. So for Tony Ferguson, he's a 5 out of 10. I can't really put him lower than a 5 considering what he's achieved in the UFC and the fact that he was once one of the best lightweights in the world. But as of right now, this dude has lost to every single ranked lightweight you can think of, including guys like Nate Diaz and Pimblett as well, which makes this thing even more depressing. So for Tony Ferguson, I'm going to have to stick him in the 5 out of 10 category. And then for 6 out of 10, fighters who are above average. Not special, but above average. I'm going Paddy Pimblett, I'm letting Paddy Pimblett represent that 6 out of 10 spot. He's undefeated in the UFC, kicked off his UFC career with 3 finishes in the first and the second round. Then he got the robbery win over Jared Gordon. He was able to beat Tony Ferguson, and now he's got a fight with Bobby Green. And win or loss, I think we've got to give Paddy Pimblett a 6 out of 10. He isn't a top lightweight. I can't say he's a 7, 8 or 9 out of 10 because he just isn't a top lightweight and he hasn't proved that yet. But he's definitely above a 5 out of 10. I've got to say Paddy Pimblett's above average. He's always going to be around the ranking area. He's not just going to be, I'd say like a 5 out of 10 are the guys that Pimblett has beaten. You know what I mean? A Jordan Levitt, a Luigi Vendramini, he's probably a 4. But Tony Ferguson, those are the guys that are a 5 out of 10. Paddy Pimblett, he's got some skill, he's got decent jiu-jitsu, he's got power, and I reckon he has potential to get ranked one day. So if he can beat Bobby Green, definitely worth that 6 out of 10 spot. And you know what, even if he loses to Bobby Green, I'll still argue that Pimblett's a 6 out of 10 fighter. He's above average, nothing special, but nothing terrible in the UFC, so 6 out of 10. And now we're on a 7 out of 10. A representative for the 7 out of 10, definitely above average and a solid fighter. And I have chosen Alexander Volkov to represent a 7 out of 10. Never going to beat the top guys in the division. You're never going to see this guy beating a Curtis Blades or a Cyril Gane or a Tom Aspinall. Essentially, the elite of the division will always beat Alexander Volkov. But he's able to get wins over the guys who just aren't that good for the division, like a Tatu Ivaza or a Romanov or a Rosenstreich or a Tubura or, all those guys in the lower rankings of the heavyweight division. Now, the reason Volkov's only a 7 as well is because he is in the heavyweight division, one of the most uncompetitive divisions in the UFC. But he's proven that he can beat all the fat heavyweights. He's just not good enough for the top 5 area. So for Alexander Volkov, I'll give him a 7 out of 10. Solid fighter, not elite, not champion material, but he's definitely, in that upper echelon of fighters in the UFC. And now we're on to an 8 out of 10 fighter. A fighter who is definitely extremely skilled in the UFC. So for the 8 out of 10, I've chosen Pantoja to represent an 8 out of 10. One of the best fighters in the UFC gives you an 8 out of 10 status. Yeah, Pantoja, I think an 8 out of 10's fair. He's got some great wins. I mean, he's pretty much cleared out the flyweight division. He's beaten Royval, Manel Kape, Alex Perez, Brandon Moreno 3 times, Brandon Royval twice, Steve Erceg. If Pantoja can wrap like maybe 1 or 2 more wins, I'd push him to a 9 out of 10. He's on the pound for pound list, and to be honest, I think he's criminally low. So for Alejandro Pantoja, I think that 8 out of 10 ranking is fair. Definitely one of the best fighters in the UFC. He is in the flyweight division. If this dude was, let's say, in like the lightweight division or the bantamweight division, and he had this type of resume, he'd probably be like a 10. But for Pantoja, I'll give him a straight 8. But if this dude gets 1 or 2 more wins on his resume, I'd probably have to push him to like, I'll probably have to push him to like a 9 out of 10, maybe even a 10 out of 10. So for Pantoja, one of the best, definitely the best in this division right now, I'll give him an 8 out of 10. And then for a 9 out of 10 fighter, for a fighter that's practically definitely one of the best in the UFC at the 9 out of 10 spot, I'll give that to Leon Rocky Edwards. Leon Edwards, for me, has to get that 9 out of 10 spot. He's only had like a handful of losses, if that, in the UFC. One of them being to Kamaru Usman, a guy that he's beaten twice already. I mean, look at the guys he's beaten. I mean, he's beaten Kamaru Usman, the pound-for-pound #1 at the time. The dude who looked unstoppable in the welterweight division. He KO'd him and took him to a decision as well, which is super impressive. He's also got wins over guys like Luke as well. The performance against Nate Diaz was amazing as well. I know everyone's going to bring up the point where he got caught, but for like 24 minutes of that fight, he was dominated Diaz. He's got the win over Colby Covington. He's super well-rounded, and I honestly think Leon Edwards is going to rule the welterweight division for a long time. I'm giving him a 9 out of 10. There are barely any flaws in Leon Edwards' game. He can grapple, he can strike, he's a fairly, risk-free fighter. He doesn't like to take risks, but he's very, very skilled, is Leon Edwards. 9 out of 10, one of the best in the UFC, and for that 10 out of 10 spot, the most skilled fighter you can create in the UFC, that is going to Islam Makhachev. Pound for pound #1, and in my opinion, the best in the UFC. There is no flaws in Islam Makhachev's game. This dude looks unstoppable. He's got wrestling, he's got submissions, he's got striking. He is beating top level fighters at their own game. This dude KO'd one of the best strikers in the UFC in Volkanovski. This dude submitted one of the best submission artists in the UFC in Charles Oliveira. He's also taken Volkanovski to a decision. He demolished Dan Hooker. He demolished Bobby Green. And I honestly think Islam Makhachev is going to rule the lightweight division for the longest time. Even though it would be good to see Poirier get the title, if I'm being realistic, I think Makhachev's going to run through Poirier. I think he beats Arman Tsarukyan, who, by the way, he's also beaten before. Makhachev, he might not have the most stacked resume for a 10 out of 10 fighter, but as far as skill goes, it's hard to say that Makhachev isn't the most skilled fighter in the UFC right now. I think he's completely well-rounded. So for Makhachev, I think he deserves that 10 out of 10 spot, and that is my rating from the 1 to 10 scale in the UFC, from 1 being the worst to 10 being the best. Let me know if you agree with this scale, and if you'd have changed any fighters around, or maybe some fighters deserved a higher or lower spot. Let me know your thoughts on the list. Thank you for watching.